In the United States, our justice system is predicated on the notion that you are to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. And we have all sorts of laws that are designed to help ensure that people who are accused of a crime are not unjustly prosecuted. And so we have determined that there are several rights that people have. When you are arrested, you have to be informed that you have the right to remain silent. You have the right to have an attorney present as you are questioned. We have established in the Fifth Amendment that there is a right that you don't have to testify on your own behalf if it might make you look guilty. The Fifth and the 14th Amendments also guarantee to you the right of due process, which means that you can't be imprisoned without going through a proper trial. And trials themselves have all sorts of rules and regulations that are intended to ensure that we are seeking the truth and that people are receiving justice rather than being railroaded. And the truth is that throughout most of the world, that's kind of the idea that people take in most justice systems. That most justice systems throughout the world have similar kinds of protections. Now, that's not the case everywhere. And in some places, the justice system is really a mockery of justice. And sometimes people refer to these legal proceedings as kangaroo courts. And a kangaroo court is really a mockery of what is true legal proceedings. Because a kangaroo court is called a kangaroo court because they jump like a kangaroo to conclusions, rather than going through the process of actually trying to seek the truth. They come into the court, and this person, we've already decided what the verdict is. We're just going through this in order to look good, to give the appearance of going through the process of seeking justice, when in fact the outcome was determined before we ever began. That's called a kangaroo court, and there are places in the world where that's the case. You are arrested in the middle of the night, and you know what your verdict is before we ever have the trial. These things are a way to appear that justice is served while at the same time making a mockery of justice itself. This morning, we get to look at a story of Jesus basically being tried by a kangaroo court. This is a situation where the religious leaders of this day were trying to appear like they were dotting all of their I's and crossing all of their T's, and they were following all of the laws of the land in order to ensure justice, but the truth is they were railroading Jesus. And even as they tried to make sure that they followed all of the laws to convict Jesus, they ignored all of the laws about how they were supposed to really seek justice, and their conclusion was found before they had ever even begun. And so we're going to look at that account this morning. We find this in Matthew chapter 26, verses 57 through 68, which we just read. And there's a number of interesting things in this account that I think should really challenge us and help us to look at our own lives. So let's look at this. Let me start here in the first couple verses to kind of set the stage. And this is in verses 57 and 58. Then the people who had arrested Jesus led him to the home of Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of religious law and the elders had gathered. Meanwhile, Peter followed him at a distance and came to the high priest's courtyard. He went in and sat with the guards and waited to see how it would all end. So if you recall, last week we talked about how Jesus was betrayed by Judas, and so Judas showed up. He had talked to the religious leaders, said, "I'll betray Jesus to you." He comes with this, basically with this army and these religious leaders, and they arrest Jesus. And Jesus is now taken into the high priest's house, and Peter and probably John followed along behind him. Everybody else kind of fled, but Peter and most likely John followed, and they waited to see what was going to happen. And we see that Peter was trying to remain anonymous, but he kind of failed in that. And we'll talk a lot more about Peter's experience next week. But you need to understand that all of this is going on at the same time. There's kind of these parallel stories going on here. But for the modern reader, us, as we look at this story, we have some questions. What's the deal with Caiaphas? What's high priest? What's up with this whole trial? And if you compare the other gospel accounts, it kind of muddies the waters even more. Because in John's gospel, we read about a guy by the name of Annas. And it says that Jesus first went to the house of Annas, the high priest. He was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest. And we go, whoa, wait a second. Which one's the high priest? Some people have looked at this and they say, well, see, this is a contradiction. The Bible doesn't even know what it's talking about. No, as a matter of fact, the Bible knows exactly what it's talking about. You see, the high priest was basically the highest religious post in the land in Israel at that time. And the idea in Jewish law was that the high priest was to be appointed for life. So as long as he was alive, he continued to be the high priest. But Rome had taken over Israel. And so Rome began to feel as though they needed to exert their own influence and their own power on the nation of Israel. And apparently Annas did something that didn't please the Roman government. So they said, you're no longer the high priest. And instead they picked this guy, Caiaphas, who was Annas' son-in-law. And Caiaphas now became the high priest. Well, there were going to be many Jews who said, I don't care who you put there, Annas is the true high priest. So probably Jesus appeared before both of these men as a way of appeasing all of the people, as though to say, either one of these guys, but they both condemn him, they're both the high priest, and so that's what's going on here. But we say, well, what's the deal with this whole assembly of people? It says that there were these religious leaders, the teachers of religious law, the elders, they had all gathered. And probably what this is this is a group that is known as the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin was basically kind of like the Supreme Court equivalent in that society. That the most difficult questions would come and rise to the level of the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin would make their determination. And this was made up of 71 members, one of whom, the presiding member, was the high priest. And so he kind of would have the tie-breaking vote of this 71 if necessary. And so these were the teachers of religious law, the experts in the religious law. And we might think that these are the people who are the most devout people in all of Israel. But we'd be wrong. These were the most powerful people in all of Israel. And the most powerful people in all of Israel are really not that much different than the most powerful people in the United States. It's really more about power than it is about being fit for the job. It's about the amount of money that you have, the people that you know, and the people that you manage to make happy, and your ability to make the people who actually have power happy. And so these men, even though they were religious leaders, probably were not the most devout people. They were people who were really good at playing the game of politics and had become these people with great religious power. And so this is kind of the background. I want you to understand this as we go into this story, because as we read about the trial, we've got to understand and be able to kind of picture what's going on here. Jesus is standing trial before this group of 71 men who are the most powerful people in all of Israel, and they have already decided his fate. So let's look now at the quote-unquote trial and what happens here. We see this is in verses 59 through 68. It says, inside, the leading priests and the entire high council, that is the Sanhedrin, were trying to find witnesses who would lie about Jesus so they could put him to death. But even though they had found many who agreed to give false witness, they could not use anyone's testimony. Finally, 2 men came forward who declared, this man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, well, aren't you going to answer these charges? What do you have to say for yourself? But Jesus remained silent. Then the high priest said to him, I demand in the name of the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. Jesus replied, you have said it. And in the future, you will see the Son of Man seated in the place of power at God's right hand and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothing to show his horror and said, blasphemy! Why do we need any other witnesses? You have all heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict? Guilty, they shouted. He deserves to die. Then they began to spit in Jesus' face and beat him with their fists. And some slapped him, jeering, prophesy to us, you Messiah. Who hit you that time? So, as I said, this is a trial in a loose sense of the term. It really wasn't about justice. They weren't looking for the truth. They were looking for a way to condemn Jesus. And the Jewish law was pretty clear on how this was supposed to work. You could not condemn someone to death based on only the testimony of one person. The Jewish law was intended to make sure that we didn't condemn people who were innocent. And so you had to have 2 independent testimonies who could both declare that someone had committed a crime worthy of death. And so apparently this must have taken the Jewish leaders off guard. Judas's experience and Judas's willingness to come to them must have surprised them because they didn't have witnesses lined up. They weren't prepared. And so they were scrambling, trying to find people who would somehow come and testify that Jesus had done something worthy of death. And they found all sorts of people who were willing to lie about Jesus. The problem was that none of their stories matched up. They'd say, well, what did Jesus do? Well, he did this. Well, what did he do? Well, they didn't match up. So they couldn't use any of these testimonies against these people, or against Jesus, rather. But finally they found two men who both independently said, Jesus declared that he would destroy the temple of God and then rebuild it 3 days later. And they said, well, two guys agree. And you know what? Under Roman law, even planning to do that would be a capital offense. Plotting to destroy a temple was a capital offense under Roman law because it was basically terrorism. And so they said that would be a crime that we could execute him for. And so they said, we have two people who have done this, who have declared that Jesus said that he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. And truth is, Jesus said something similar to that. He didn't say exactly that. He said something similar to that. And we see that over actually in John chapter 2. And this is at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, right after he had cleared the temple. And so this is what he says. This is after he's cleared the temple. He's flipped over all the tables, and the Jewish leaders come to him in verse 18. It says, the Jewish leaders demanded, what are you doing? If God gave you authority to do this, show us a miraculous sign to prove it. All right, Jesus replied, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. What? They exclaimed. It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you can rebuild it in 3 days? But when Jesus said this temple, he meant his own body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered he had said this, and they believed both the scriptures and what Jesus had said. So Jesus did say, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. But he wasn't talking about the building. He was talking about his body. And ironically, as these guys declare that he said this in order to get him killed, they were fulfilling what Jesus said. He says, you will destroy my body, and in 3 days later you will find that I raised it up. They're playing right into Jesus' hand, but this is what they use to try and condemn Jesus. And so at this point they feel like, I think we've got him. But the high priest wanted to make sure. He wanted to make sure that Jesus was nailed dead to rights. So he started questioning Jesus directly, which was out of the ordinary. That wouldn't normally be what would happen. And so he asked Jesus, he says, what do you have to say to this? Are you going to respond to these charges? And Jesus said nothing. I go, well, why not say anything? And I think there's some wisdom in what Jesus says, or doesn't say rather, because he understands that sometimes when people have already made up their minds, no amount of arguing, no amount of defending yourself is going to do anything to change them. And so Jesus remained silent. He took the high road, which ticked Caiaphas off. So he put Jesus under an oath. And he says, I demand in the name of the living God. This is an oath that he is declaring to Jesus. Tell us, what does he say here? Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. So he asks Jesus directly, tell us what you are. And so Jesus now answers this question. And Jesus' answer basically is, you have said it. And people say, well, Jesus was being evasive. Why didn't Jesus just say, yes, I am. Why has it taken you so long to understand this? But that's not what he said. He goes, you have said it. And so some people have concluded at this and said, Jesus didn't really believe himself to be God in the flesh. This is something that was invented by the council, or something that was exaggerated years later by his followers. Jesus didn't really believe himself to be God. He was just an innocent victim, and he would be horrified if we viewed him this way today. Those people didn't read the rest of Jesus' answer, because read the rest of this here. He says, you have said it. And in the future, you will see the Son of Man seated in the place of power at God's right hand and coming on the clouds of heaven. Jesus is basically quoting from the book of Daniel, where there's this talk about the Son of Man who is worthy to sit down at the right hand of God. The Son of Man in the book of Daniel is basically, he's equal with God. And Jesus says, you know that guy in the book of Daniel? That's me. And so Jesus is saying quite clearly, I am God. I am the Messiah. I am the Son of God. And what he is saying to these men is, you today sit in judgment over me, but one day you will be judged by me. You think Jesus was saying that he was God? Oh, there's no question. Yes, he said, you have said it, but he also said, I am God in the flesh. And you would do well to recognize that, but they didn't. Now, again, we go, well, this is really kind of, this is one of those things that we wouldn't necessarily pick up on that as a claim to deity. But there was no one in that room who was unclear on what Jesus was saying. They knew the scriptures. They knew what it said in Daniel. As Jesus said this, they knew exactly what he was saying. And so now people began to get horrified. And the high priest's response was to tear his robes, which was a sign of mourning, and he declares, blasphemy! This man has declared himself to be God. And when a man claims to be God, he is blaspheming because no man is God. And the priest is right, unless that person's Jesus. Jesus was the one person for whom it would not be blasphemy for him to declare himself to be God, because he actually was. And so he turns to the crowd, he goes, so what is your verdict? He turns to the council, the rest of the court, who really at this point is probably a mob, and says, what is your verdict? He's guilty. What should we do? He deserves to die. And at that point, things devolved into chaos. They blindfolded him, they spit on him, and they started to mock him, mockingly calling him the Messiah. And they hit him and they go, hey, if you're the Messiah, tell us who hit you. And sadly, this is just the beginning of the indignity that Jesus would face for the next several hours. This was just the beginning of it. But here was God incarnate, God in the flesh, who was submitting himself to such incredible indignity. Now, the Jewish leaders needed additional approval. They actually, though they had declared that Jesus should be executed, they actually didn't have the power to do that. They needed Roman leaders to allow that. And so in the coming weeks, we'll see the process that they went through in order to get kind of a rubber stamp on their declaration of execution. But we see this account this morning of this kind of kangaroo court. And it's an interesting account, and again, I think there's a lot of things that we can learn from it. And so we ask ourselves, well, what is it that we are supposed to learn from this account? And I came up with three different things. First, that it is possible to appear to be religious or righteous while actually doing evil. These people, these Jewish leaders, were the religious leaders of the day. They were the people who were supposed to be devout. They were the ones who were supposed to be caring about what God said, and yet they didn't. They committed one of the greatest, probably the greatest, miscarriage of justice in all of history. And we go, well, how does that happen? How did they do this? Well, it's interesting. There's a commentator by the name of William Barclay, and he has gone through some of their ancient texts and has found some of the rules that they were supposed to follow in regards to trials. And they found that they were following some of the rules. You had to have 2 witnesses in order to condemn someone, etc. But they ignored many others. And here's a list of some of the ways that they violated these rules. 1, no trial was ever to be conducted at night. 2, a trial was not to be conducted during the Passover week. 3, trials were only to take place in the hall of hewn stone in the temple complex, not at the house of the high priest. 4, witnesses were to be examined separately in order to ensure that there was no collusion between them. 5, evidence in favor of the accused person's innocence must be presented first, and then evidence of their guilt. There was no evidence presented in favor of Jesus' innocence. And then number 6, a sentence of death could not be carried out on the same day as the trial. There was a mandatory waiting period of at least 1 full night in order to give the people time to think about whether they should extend mercy or not. You see, these men, under the guise of being religious, emphasized the laws that would help them get what they wanted and ignored the ones that would stand in their way. We've got to be careful that we don't do the same thing. It's easy for us to look at these guys and say, how terrible, what a terrible miscarriage of justice, and how they have abused God's law. But we need to recognize that we sometimes do that as well. Think about it. We want to condemn others when they do something that hurts us or something that we find to be grievous. But when we mess up, we want those same people to extend grace to us. We tend to be really harsh in condemning the sins in others that are things that we don't struggle with, while downplaying the ones that we do. We seem to be able to find endless ways to justify our own greed instead of giving to the Lord or giving to those in need. We're masters of convincing ourselves that we don't have time for the things of God, like worship or Bible study or prayer or service, when the truth is we just don't value the things of God. We take Scripture out of context to justify the things that we want, instead of searching the Scriptures to see what God actually says and then submitting to Him. Christians have done all sorts of terrible things through the years while using Scripture to try and support their position. We support a particular position or candidate or whatever in ways that run contrary to God's commands. And sometimes we resort to ungodly tactics in an effort to ensure that we get justice. In other words, what we want. You see, there are myriad ways in which we are a whole lot more like the pen of the Sanhedrin than we would like to admit. And this account ought to be a cautionary tale to us, that we need to examine our own hearts. We need to ask ourselves, why do I make the decisions that I do? When we are faced with a decision, when we are put under pressure, when we find ourselves having to decide what to do, ask yourself a simple question and answer it honestly. What is it that I want most? And the problem is that often we lie to ourselves and we go, oh, I want to honor God. Do we really? If our answer is something other than, I want to honor God in everything that I do, if it's, I want my way, I want to be comfortable, I want this, I want that, then we fall into the same trap that the men of the Sanhedrin did. And so what we need to stop and do is we need to say, God, I want to do what you want. Show me what it is, and I will seek to follow. That's the first thing that we learn, is that we can appear religious while doing evil. The second thing is that God's plan isn't thwarted by evil people. This is the greatest miscarriage of justice in all of history. This is the greatest injustice. It's a great travesty. And yet, God wasn't surprised by the actions of the Sanhedrin. That's not to say that he was condoning it. It's not to say that he said, oh, yeah, that's the right thing to do. But he wasn't surprised by it. And he wasn't thrown off by it. God's plan wasn't somehow taken off track because of the evil actions of sinful men. And what this means for us is that even when things aren't going our way, even when it feels like the world is falling down around us, we can continue to do what we know is right. Because we go, well, but if I do what's right, then I might not get justice. I might not get my way. God is in control. And the question we have to ask is, do we trust Him enough to follow Him even when we don't see how it's going to work out for us? Do we believe that He's got a plan that can't be thwarted by evil people? And if we do, then it should cause us to be obedient, even when it means that maybe we won't get our way, or maybe it might seem like evil will triumph for a time. Will we trust God enough to be obedient, or will we trust ourselves in order to try and force our own agenda? And then the last thing that we learn from this is that each of us must also render a judgment on Jesus. Jesus stood trial before these religious leaders, and they rendered a judgment on Him, but we must do the same. We have to understand that we have to answer this question of, who is this Jesus? What does He mean? What is the importance of Him? There are people all around the world who will tell you that Jesus was a great moral teacher. But those same people, many of them would say Jesus would be appalled by the idea that he was God. I hope you've seen today that Jesus was pretty clear on who he was and who he is. The question that you must face is, what will you do with his testimony and with the testimony of others have given about him? Will you answer him? Will you follow him? Or will you believe him? Or will you believe into all these other competing notions of truth that exist? Who is Jesus to you? Is he just a figure from history? Is he someone who gives you insight in how to live? Is he someone who helps you out in times of trouble? Is he an example to emulate? Or is he something more? Jesus' message is clear. You are not good, and you need his help. You see, it's easy for us to convince ourselves that we are basically good people, that we basically are good deep down, but we aren't. God calls us to be perfect, and quite frankly, that ship has sailed long ago. Every single one of us has sinned and deserves condemnation. Our only hope is for someone to volunteer to take that penalty for us and pay it, someone whose life is of far greater value than ours. And Jesus uniquely meets those requirements. So the question is, what will you do with that knowledge? The only way we can be forgiven is if we will turn to Jesus and we will ask him to do what we cannot, to forgive us and to begin the process of changing us from the inside out. It means seeking to live our lives in a way that honors him, not because that somehow makes us good enough to get into heaven, but because we trust God enough to want to live in the way that he tells us to. Because we trust him enough to follow him and to know that his way is right and good, and because we know that one day we will have to give an account before him for our actions. So that's the real question that you must grapple with. Who is Jesus to you? If Jesus is nothing more than a person you think of on Sunday, if he is not the one who is the focus of your life, be on guard, because you ignore him at your own peril. Jesus was tried in a kangaroo court. He was judged unfairly, and the result was an incredible miscarriage of justice. But we have to remember that one day we too will stand trial. But unlike in Jesus' trial, justice will be served. So don't make the same mistake of the religious leaders of Jesus' day. See Jesus for who he really is, and then follow him with everything that you've got. Will you pray with me? Our Heavenly Father, we marvel at the love that is shown for us in the person of Jesus. We marvel at the majesty of Jesus. But Lord, don't let us stop at simply marveling, at being impressed, at being amazed by the story, because that's not enough. You demand more from us. You demand a response. So, Father, we pray that you would help us to seek you, to trust you, to follow you in every aspect of our lives. Help us not to make the same mistake of these religious leaders. Help us not to see the person of Jesus and be unchanged. Help us to see who you are, and then to change our lives in response. For we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.